Good afternoon, good evening, and everyone, depending on which time zone you are. This is Ling Ju from University of Houston, and I'm the outgoing section chair for the APSA organized section on public administration. One nice tradition of our section is that the outgoing section chair is rewarded by the end of the term with the great honor to introduce the recipient of the Gaus Award. And this year, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Christopher Hood as the recipient of the 2021 American Political Science Association John Gaus Award. The Gaus Award and Lectureship honors a lifetime exemplary scholarship in the joint tradition of political science and public administration. And as the Gaus Award Committee stated this year, Professor Hood fully fits the bill. Dr. Christopher Hood is currently a visiting professor at the Blenvanik School of Government and Emeritus Fellow of the All Souls College, the University of Oxford. Dr. Hood was also the Gladstone Professor of Government at All Souls College, Oxford from 2010 to 2014, and the director of the ESRC research programming on public services, quality, performance, and delivery from 2004 to 2010. As a leading expert and globally renowned scholar in both political science and public administration, Dr. Hood specializes in the study of executive government, regulation, and public sector reform. Since his book in 1976 entitled The Limits of Administration, Dr. Hood has made substantive contributions to the field of public administration and political science for 5 decades. There are entire fields of knowledge that would look substantively different without his contribution. I myself, as a student and scholar in public administration and political science, often find it almost impossible to escape Dr. Hood's intellectual influence, right? From his early time award-winning book, The Art of State, to his most recent award-winning book, A Government That Worked Better and Cost Less. And one of the most cited articles in public management, A Public Management for All Seasons. So for 5 decades, Dr. Hood has continuously shaped our field and state of the art of public administration research by firmly grounding his work in multiple traditions in political science, public administration, and organizational science. Again, citing the award committee's statement this year, they find Dr. Hood's work showcases the perfect combination of rigorous theory and practically important knowledge. As the Gaus Award Committee noted, a persistent characteristic of Dr. Hood's work is a willingness to take on big themes central to how our government works, right? Across the wide range of his former publications, will always capture important themes such as risk, reform, blame, performance, culture, and accountability. And he's also a master of developing frameworks that make the application of these themes both systematic and intuitive, establishing coherent research agenda that has benefited other scholars across different fields immeasurably. We admire his ability to use theory in the ways that clarifies rather than obscure. And this is in no small part due to his absolute commitment to relevance. His work is also embedded in real-world examples, sometimes contemporary and sometimes historical lessons, and the writing is always in an accessible and engaging way. In summary, his lifetime of penetrating analysis of public services make Dr. Christopher Hood richly deserving for the Gaus Award. And let me also add that Dr. Hood's intellectual influence also traveled globally. He has taught public administration and political science on 3 different continents. I think that itself is a great achievement. Educated at the University of York and Glasgow, he was a member of research team which firstly coined the term Quango in the 1970s, and also the first to use the term in print. And then in the 1980s, he also coined the terms bureaumetrics and new public management, which later became very prevalent in the study of bureaucracy and public sector management. He is currently leading a research project that based at University of Oxford's Blenvanik School of Government, which evaluates the UK public expenditure control system from the 1990s to the 2010s. With that, I'm very pleased to present you the 2021 Gaus Award recipient, Dr. Christopher Hood. And we'll all be very keen to learn what will be the new buzzword coined by him today that will also continue to show influence to our field. Thank you.
Good afternoon, or good evening, everyone, or good whatever time of day it is where you are. After that build-up from Professor Zhu, I can only disappoint. So my first task must be to lower your expectations. Please remember this is 10 p.m. at night for me, and not a time of day at which I'm accustomed to giving presentations. And as you can probably see, I'm speaking to you from the kitchen come living room of the small apartment where we live. And yesterday as well, I had a COVID vaccination, which I've got some reaction to. So it's not ideal circumstances for me. I don't really know whether I'm more surprised or more delighted to receive this great honor. Certainly I felt both of those emotions, and I want to begin by sincerely thanking the APSA Public Administration section for conferring it on me, and I want to tell you how much it means to me. I first came across the work of the great John Gaus when I was a graduate student in Scotland, goodness, 50 years ago now. And I remember John Gaus's ecological approach to public administration, his insistence that public administration needs to be studied literally from the ground up, made a big impression on me. That was because I was trying to get an ecological angle, as you may say, on the development of the tax state at that time, how tax systems develop and what make them effective. We all know that the word awesome is rather overdone these days, but looking at the list of John Gaus Award winners over the years, I'm truly humbled that you've considered me, a foreigner, to be worthy of being in their number. That's because there are so many names in that list whose work I have admired, and many of whom I've known quite well, such as Aaron Wildavsky and Vincent Ostrom, both of whom were very kind to me and influenced my work. I wish that they were still around so that I could thank them for all that they did for me. And the same goes for my British, European, and indeed Antipodean mentors such as Bill Mackenzie, Mary Douglas, Andrew Dunsire, and Michael Jackson, just to mention a few. To those of you who are gathered in Seattle this afternoon, I would give a great deal to be with you in person for this very big event in my professional life. But by force of circumstance, in the form of the presidential proclamation that restricts UK travel to the United States, and thanks to modern technology in the form of video conferencing, it has to be done differently this time. So I bring you greetings from Kilburn in North London, where our small apartment is, about 50 yards from where these photographs were taken. This, what you're looking at, is the Kilburn High Road. And it's a relic of empire, in this case, a relic of the Roman Empire, which ruled most of Britain for about 4 centuries. And you can see it's a typical dead straight Roman road. And just as it was in the days of the Roman Empire, it's one of the main routes out of London going north. And as you can maybe see, it's a gritty kind of place, not exactly on the tourist trail. It has its share of inner city problems, crime, pollution, poverty. Usually it's absolutely full of people and vehicles, buses, trucks, vans, cars, motorbikes, ambulances, e-scooters, you name it, grinding up and down day and night. But on the morning of Wednesday, 26th of March last year, I walked down the middle of this road in the morning for a mile or so, and I had it completely to myself. There was no traffic at all, nobody on the sidewalks. I saw no one at all. An ominous and eerie feeling in a city of 8 million people, roughly the same size as New York. So what was going on? Well, the COVID pandemic was going on, or just getting going, as it turned out. That was the first day of the first lockdown in England last year, a completely new experience for me and for the vast majority of people. Indeed, the word lockdown had hardly come into currency at that time. And that walk that I took down the middle of this road in March of last year was the beginning of a whole lot of big changes in my life that I wasn't expecting. A mixture of globalization in some ways as COVID spread across the whole planet, and many of us got used to a life of Zoom meetings with people from here, there, and everywhere, but also deglobalization as borders shut and travel stopped. I'm sure many of us have got similar stories to tell. So I hope you'll indulge me if in this talk, which I'm going to keep short and which I should stress is not a research paper, I offer a few reflections on the governance and politics of COVID. Now, dealing with contagious and infectious disease among animals, people, or both is a classic function of the state. It applies in every age in one way or another. And at a time like this, it's normal to look for precedents or historical parallels. And there are some fascinating histories of the way different states have tackled disease in different ways over the years. And today, I want to refer to Peter Baldwin's excellent book published 20 odd years ago on contagion and the state, in which Baldwin looked at how 4 different states, France, Sweden, Britain, and the German states that later became the German Empire, and what those states did in response to severe contagious and infectious disease in the 19th century. The diseases that Baldwin focused on in that study were cholera, smallpox, and syphilis, all of which were mass killers in the 19th century. And he poses 2 questions in that book, both of which I think are just as applicable to the COVID pandemic and how it's been tackled today. One of the questions relates to how states approached those epidemics, what they did to suppress, mitigate, and manage them. What tools did they use in the face of these challenges? For example, vaccination emerged as an effective prophylactic for smallpox from the late 18th century, and some states were very early in the field in promoting it, such as Sweden. Others, such as Prussia, for example, were much slower. And so that's one kind of question that we can ask. Baldwin's other question looks at the other side of the coin to ask how states and their politics were shaped by their experience of coping with disease episodes and how that affected their future responses. For example, how they handled HIV/AIDS a century later. Now, in the case of COVID, there's a lot of dedicated and high-level effort going into tracking COVID policies internationally, not least by the brilliant Our World in Data website that partially emanates from my own institution, the University of Oxford, though I should take no credit for it. But in this lecture today, I'd just like to make a couple of observations from a public administration perspective, or maybe that should be my public administration perspective, concerning the decision machinery and the policy instruments used in tackling COVID. As far as the decision machinery is concerned, one of my observations relates to the top level executive governance of COVID policy, where in a number of cases, I think we're seeing what could loosely be called dashboard government or something like that, by which I mean, as shown in this slide, a fairly continuous conversation between political decision makers and experts against a background of data that is changing in real time in a number driven process in which many of the key variables that we've come to learn about, cases, mortality, hospitalization, R rates, all of those variables are publicly quantified, and where there are a number of different objectives in tension, as shown in this slide. One of the things that can happen in terrible plagues is that people can starve to death if the economy completely collapses. So one of the items that needs to be thought about in these deliberations is what can be done to avoid collapse in basic social systems, such as food supply. But another key element has been the issue of what you have to do to avoid healthcare system collapse when you no longer have basic facilities for handling the disease. And then as far as the virus outcomes are concerned, we see a number of outcomes there. Some leaders have talked about eliminating the virus so that it simply disappears from circulation. That's been the New Zealand strategy. Others, such as my own country, have been concerned not to eliminate it, but to arrive at some kind of stable limit through herd immunity of one kind or another. But at times, it's really just been about changing the dynamic by just getting the numbers down. And in these balancing acts, these things are traded off against one another. Now, this isn't a style of decision-making that's unknown to public administration, not at all. I recall again as a student reading the ideas of people like Stafford Beer, who a generation ago spelt out the logic of data-rich governance with high variety feedback systems, inspired in that case by the contribution of operational research and similar analyses to military developments in World War II. But that's one system which I want to contrast with what I say here are more discontinuous planning styles of public management. For example, in output-oriented budgeting or 5-year planning systems. So that's one observation that I've made about the decision-making structure. And then the other observation relates to the implementation tools used by government, where what we see, and indeed I've experienced, and I expect we've all experienced, that all of government's implementation tools have come into play in the handling of the COVID issue. Nearly 40 years ago, I distinguished 4 different instrumentalities of public policy under the letters NATO, denoting not the well-known defence alliance, but different properties of government. Nodality, the property of being in the centre of information networks. Authority, the ability to permit, prohibit, compel, etc. Treasure, the use of valuable sources of value, cash or its equivalents. And finally, organisation or treatment, physical operations. We've seen all of these emerging in most of the developed countries, at least, with vigour. Here's a couple of examples of information coming out. We've all had, I think, some experience of this kind of thing. Messaging, advice, information, slogans, nudgy type things. All governments have done some of this. And then there have been debates about the clarity, the consistency of this kind of messaging. I like particularly the be kind and stay safe message here. And this is from Highland Council in Scotland. This was taken in Inverness. So that's the nodality element. And then we've got nodality in the form of information going in. Testing centres. This is my nearest testing centre in Harlesden. Track and trace systems, such as you see with the QR code and the mobile phone, where we've got used to tracking ourselves in going into buildings and the like. It works better in some places than others. The UK certainly took a very long time to get this one right. And then there's all the self-testing as well as the administered testing. So that's nodality in terms of information coming in. Then there's authority. This is the equivalent of your presidential proclamation that forbids me to go to Seattle. This is a piece of delegated legislation from the UK spelling out the powers of constables to deal with issues of isolation and sequestration. And then we have treasure, used in a great many ways. This, again, it's the Kilburn High Road, and it's just to remind me of a UK government programme last August 2020, to boost the hospitality sector after lockdown closure. I never thought I would see this. If you had a meal in a cafe or restaurant, the UK government in certain weekdays in August would pay half of the bill or a fixed dollar amount up to a maximum, and that's an example of treasure. We see across the developed economies an indication of the size of spending or equivalence. Here we've got equity loans and guarantees on this particular tool. And then finally, there's the issue of what I call organisation or treatment operations that involve some sort of physical production process, such as provision of quarantine centres, emergency hospitals set up by the military, and testing centres, vaccination centres, etc. Now, that raises all those complicated logistical issues about moving things and people across the Earth's surface to be where they need to be, stuff that we love, we public administration folk. You might possibly recognize this suspicious looking character on the left of this slide. And he's standing beside the great Hindu Swaminarayan temple in Neasden in North London, one of the wonders of the world, about a 35-minute bus ride from the Kilburn High Road that we started with. And he was there, that's me, of course, because a closed down school building beside the temple was being used as a vaccination center by a Quango called PCNS, with the stewarding and most of the admin work being done by unpaid volunteers from the temple. So we've seen all of these 4 types of policy instrumentality being used vigorously. And there are all sorts of interesting questions, I think, to be asked about how they combine, how they support one another or pull against one another. For example, how treasure can support authority. If you don't want people to go to work and you want them to stay at home, then if you've got a system of subsidizing their staying at home, that authority is likely to be more effective. So that's the policy instruments. What I want to turn to now is an issue about how the overall style might vary. And I'm just looking for my right piece of paper. Can't find it, I'll do it ad hoc. How might overall policy styles vary with such decision-making and policy instruments? Peter Baldwin, in his book, draws on the work of Erwin Ackerknecht, a very interesting historian of medicine and its response. And he suggested way back in the 1940s that the kind of responses that states took to contagious and infectious disease depended on their culture and political style. He thought that more authoritarian states would be more inclined to adopt quarantinist solutions to contagious disease, by which he meant solutions that involved identifying and isolating people who had been exposed to infection, while more liberal states would be more predisposed to environmental solutions, that is, solutions that make it less likely, less fertile conditions for disease to flourish in. In the 19th century, that included things like changing burial practices by encouraging the development of parkland cemeteries instead of vaults within crowded cities. Similarly, it involved things like building of new sewer systems, better ventilated buildings and things like that. This, I think, is a very intriguing idea because it mixes up, as I say here on this slide, prophylaxis, etiology and politics. But I'm not sure how far it really works in relation to the COVID issue. And indeed, Peter Baldwin was not sure how far it worked in relation to the diseases that he studied in the 19th century. Part of the issue is that that state capacity in terms of development or otherwise may cut across the political character of the regime, so that in less developed countries, by definition, you have less treasure available, you have probably less treatment capacity, at least of many kinds. So you have to put more weight onto authority. And you could argue that what's going on there is more to do with level of development as much as the character of the state. Similarly, certainly in the COVID era, it's not necessarily the case that if we're going to call liberal states liberal democracies, it's not clear that they always are more predisposed to environmental solutions. We've seen many examples in the COVID era of democracies with strong popular support going for quite radical lockdown and border closures and so on. So, and also I think it's difficult within the quarantinist and environmental distinction to score vaccination exactly. I think that you could say vaccination might be authoritarian if it's made compulsory, as Sweden did in 1816. But if it's simply offered, that doesn't seem to me to count as an authoritarian instrument. And I don't know if I can get this up here. There's this is a stringency index developed by the Our World in Data issue. And if you haven't seen this website, it's very well worth looking at it. And this is trying to give an indication of how stringently states have imposed things like school closures, closures of workplaces, border closures, travel bans, etc. And they've tracked it over time. This is the kind of data that we need to track those differences between state capacity and the measures taken. Let's get back to just finding. Sorry about this. That'll help. Sorry about that, everyone. Technology glitch. Can you hear me again now? Hello?
Yes.
Okay, then what I want to wrap up now, but I want to just say something briefly about the other question that Baldwin raised, namely, what about the effect on states from responses to COVID? How has that, or might it develop? This is all speculative, obviously. But here we're interested in what does the experience of major disease handling, how does it shape the state? What does it leave behind? What kind of path dependence might it impose for future episodes? And I've identified 3 issues here, which I thought we could discuss. One relates to the decision style, both in terms of the kind of tools that government uses for policy implementation, but also the decision style of the dashboard governance measure as well. Will that carry over into future episodes and crises? Well, you might say, why not? If it works for COVID policy, why not apply it to climate change policy and other issues like that? I think that there are 2 things that I would say about it. One is it makes high demands on headspace and bandwidth of top political players. And as far as blame, which as you know is a favorite subject of mine, as far as blame is concerned, it tends to lend itself more to sharing blame rather than to dodging blame. It can also make heavy demands on resources, and endless changes of course can be frustrating for managers and deliverers. Second question would be about the fiscal impact of all this, in particular debt and fiscal policy. And here I think the question before the court is whether we will see a permanent upsizing of the state, such as many have argued for it to take on new functions, or will we see renewed pressure for lower taxes and deregulation? I'd be very interested to know where you think that one is likely to go. And then third, but not necessarily finally, there's the issue of using the handling of COVID as a credit claiming opportunity, or experiencing it as a blame magnet for bureaucrats and political leaders. What I've done here is to paste Wikipedia photos of 2 leaders who you probably recognize. The lady on the left is Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who romped home to a landslide election win last year with an absolute majority in a proportional representation system carefully designed to prevent that from happening. And on the basis of her handling of the COVID crisis. On the right-hand side, you see Yoshihide Suga, the Japanese Prime Minister, who presided over the Tokyo Olympics, but last month announced that he was standing down after his approval ratings hit an all-time low over the handling of COVID. And there are others that we could add into the mix, such as Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland, again, opposite cases. Obviously, we're going to see systematic research on this issue in time, but as of now, those examples suggest that COVID isn't an automatic blame magnet or a surefire credit claiming opportunity. A lot seem to depend on framing and timing. So all those 3 issues, on which I'd be very interested to hear what you've got to say, are, as it were, known unknowns, but we'll know the answers to them in due course. But what remains to be seen, of course, are the unknown unknowns, and maybe we can talk about that as well. Thank you for your patience, and I'm sorry about the glitch with the IT system.
Thank you very much, Chris. And now the screen is open for the audience, for those who may have questions or comments for the lecture. Any question from the audience? I guess I can start with one, Chris. I'm very intrigued by your last slides, especially your comments on accountability and blame and credit claiming behavior of governments during the crisis time. I wonder, one of the underlying premise of voters be able to evaluate government accountability is a clear set of policy goals being defined, right, and being used in that evaluation. Given the current ongoing pandemic, many governments face tough decisions or perhaps trade-offs between economic recovery or managing the economy versus managing the pandemic. I'll be curious to hear more of your thoughts on what will inform us to know better about systematic understanding of why in some countries, right, public health seems to be more prioritized than others. Well, taking US as an example, where at least in some states, right, economic recovery seems to be placed as the first priority during a time of crisis.
Yes, I think that I'd be interested to know what others think. I think as one of the things I was trying to capture in that dashboard governance style is that in managing a plague, of course, there has to be some concern with keeping the basics of the economy, indeed, government and other basic social systems going. Otherwise, the collateral damage gets really serious. All governments face that, but I think one of the things that has surprised me is the variation, it seems to me, in public response in terms of how much public opinion wants lockdown, social separation, restriction of economic and other activity. And again, I think that what we probably need to test is in trying to pin that down is how the public make those trade-offs where government isn't covering the cost of social isolation. That seems to me probably to be the test. In the UK, we've spent something like $100 billion to maintain people on furlough from work. That is to say, people who can't work because their workplace is not able to operate. So I'm not saying that that's a costless choice for them, but at least they're being compensated for it. And it seems to me that that's different from circumstances in which the public themselves face the choice between income from work and safety from pandemic infection.
I'd like to ask a follow-up question, if I may.
Sure, go ahead, Jean, please.
I'm interested in looking at it historically. Have previous pandemics and epidemics been politicized in the same way that this one has? And it's really not just in the U.S. Anywhere you find populist leaders, there's a high degree of politicization. Boris Johnson, Vladimir Putin, Bolsonaro in Brazil, all these leaders have been very cavalier about even trying to manage the pandemic. And some of them are actually seem pretty resilient politically. not in the case of Donald Trump, but he may actually stage a comeback. That's uncertain as yet, but the interplay between, the populist ideology and the populist leadership styles and the pandemic is very interesting to me.
Yeah, so one thing that I took out of my slides, which I originally had, but I wanted to keep them down to a reasonable number, related to quarantine policy. And I had a famous picture from the I think the City Library of New York, which is of the Staten Island quarantine station being burned down by an angry crowd who were protesting against the state's policy of accepting immigrants and exposing the local population to the risk of disease. And I wanted to put that in as an example of a state-maintained facility, in that case, hostile, in that case, encountering popular hostility, at least among those activists. And I think that there certainly is in United States history. And I think I remember reading about this in Oliver McDonough's book called A Pattern of Government Growth, in which he was interested in the regulation of shipping, carrying immigrants from Europe to the United States, and which was potentially a very big source, particularly of cholera and diseases like that, where you get the development of the whole quarantine establishment in the United States. And I think that probably is an example where it gets politicized or got politicized.
We also have Daniel Huss in the audience who has a question. Daniel, please.
Yeah, thank you. I'm interested in your take on the role of information, both misinformation and information, and how that plays into blame and credit, especially among bureaucrats. Often we think about information as in maybe simplistic terms, where there's just real information and then misinformation. And I think there's something to that, but then there's also different disagreements on information, right? We see this with the people resigning in the FDA over disagreements about protocols. And, in this world of kind of siloed information sources, I'm just curious, do you think that plays a role, and, compared to in the past? Thanks.
Thank you for that. I'll need to think about that. I'd be grateful for some more material on that. I think that if what you're getting at is that there are multiple forms of information in play. So, for example, the different types of medical evidence and expertise that comes into that dashboard governance style, I think certainly that can cause friction. And there's also the issue of what gets prioritized over what, and whose information gets more attention. For instance, it's been said in the UK that the behavioural experts in the room, as it were, have had less attention, and as a result, avoidable errors have been made in the state response, for example, over messaging to the public, as I gave in some of those photos that I took. So I think I can recognize that, and I think in that tension of different types of expertise, different kinds of medical expertise and behavioral expertise, possibly logistical expertise as well. These are definitely different kinds of knowledge which pull against one another, and I guess it's a political process as to which ones get the most attention. But maybe I've misunderstood your question, and do please tell me more.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. The question is mostly about, disagreements among expertise, which have always existed. It's just that I don't know if they've ever existed in being aired in the public and then becoming politicized the way that they are today, compared to in the past. It seems like that in the past, experts always disagree and it's kind of self-contained. And now it's because of the internet, because of social media, it seems like a different thing. And I wonder how that plays into these processes.
I think that may well be plausible. I think you may well be onto something there. I was, when I was talking about nodality as a policy tool, I was thinking of rather cruder types of information, in particular about where people are, something that you'd expect authoritarian states to specialize in, and such as in track and trace systems and the like. But I fully agree that the policy knowledge of the kind that you're referring to is definitely in the mix as well. I quite agree.
Thank you.
I also have another follow-up question, Chris, if I may. You mentioned about government style and different styles of political institutions may play a role in kind of determining what kind of policy instruments and tools will be adopted during such a time of crisis. I'm curious about how you may think about the federalist system beyond culture, beyond democracy versus authoritarian regimes. What may be the impact from federalist system in this context? Ask so more in consideration that U.S. being one of the 7 advanced democracies that has a federalist system, very decentralized decision-making system and process, right? Will that naturally become a disadvantage in responding to such a big scale crisis in an efficient way? Thank you.
Well, I'm not an expert on federalism. All that I will say is that Montesquieu, in his classical political theory on that subject, thought of federal systems as laboratories for policy and for trying out different kinds of policy in experimentation, and that's often said to be a theoretical benefit of federal systems, in the sense that different policies can be tried out, and you've got sort of natural experiments or semi-natural experiments that might ultimately be expected to result in better overall policy, as the ones that work out get adopted by get adopted. Again, I think that's a known unknown, but I think the extent to which it can work effectively depends on where the powers are to do what in the formal arrangement of power. But I think that even in the UK, which is not a federal system, but has different countries within it, Wales, Scotland, England, Northern Ireland, where different policies have been adopted, for instance, about various forms of social separation. There, I think there's definitely been learning among the systems, even although there's quite strong political tensions and antagonisms. I think that at as it were, the working level, the variety has played into a form of experimentation, and it seems to me that potentially is the big advantage of federal systems. But the potential may not be realized if the powers are in the wrong places. That would be my amateur answer. As I say, I'm not a specialist in federalism.
Chris, I have a question. Steve Smith here.
Hello, Steve.
I quite enjoyed your presentation, and that last slide where you were talking about blame and credit was quite interesting to me, which I've long been interested in that subject. And I guess I'm interested in your thoughts about the interaction between NPM type strategies and blame and credit. You know, the argument might be that countries that have aggressively pursued privatization and shifting services to the private sector, the ability of the government to take blame or credit for successful programs is diminished, and that might affect their response to COVID, and it might also affect the degree to which, you know, government can move certain policies forward. So I guess I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, about kind of the linkage between privatized services, market-based strategies, whether it's contracting out services or vouchers or to for-profit and nonprofit firms, and the kind of blame and credit that countries or governments receive now in the context of the COVID response.
Very interesting question, Steve. Again, I'm not sure that we know exactly the answer to that question, but it's a very good question. I think that part of the thinking behind that bit of NPM, which is about giving managers the authority to manage, is about a move to outsource blame from the political center, as it were, to move it to managers as opposed to the political center that sets the objectives. So that in principle there's a difference between the responsibility and therefore blame associated with the setting the targets for the managers to achieve, and the manager's ability to reach those targets. The problem, I think, in practice is that there is such a strong incentive to cheat in that system, in the sense of trying to, particularly from the political side, but not only from that side, in the sense of having their cake and eating it, both maintaining that managers are autonomous and therefore take the blame if, you know, prisoners escape or whatever, but also micromanage behind the scenes. And I think that's the weak point in that delegation system that comes up time and again. I think that as far as the contracting out type of system is concerned, if for example you're running rail services by independent or supposedly independent private companies, where what the state is doing is regulation for safety and the like, maybe price control. There again, in principle, you've got a way of isolating the blame for certain types of things. But again, the system tends to break down, partly because it's not easy to separate the responsibility for the day-to-day running of things like rail services and issues like maintenance of infrastructure. And that's where the difficulty arises with allocating blame. So I think that you're right to say that many of these developments can plausibly be attributed, in part at least, to the idea of trying to change the blame dynamic. But a lot of them end up quite messily, in my experience.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. You're muted, Ling.
Let's see if there's any additional question from the audience for Chris. If not, then let us all thank Chris for making such a wonderful lecture. And now this officially concludes the lecture portion of the event. APSA also scheduled the subsequent virtual reception after the lecture for those of you who want to have some extra time with Chris.
I'll be very happy to stay on for some time if anyone wants to talk to me, but please, we've had a good discussion. Don't feel obliged to do so. It's been very nice to see you all and to get your views.
It's our pleasure to have you with us today, Chris. And I also suggest that we be conscious about the different time zone that Chris is currently in.
So, thanks very much, Chris.
Okay. Well,
all right. Take care. I've got to move on, but thanks very much. It's been great. So
thank you, Steve. Thank you, Steve.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. That was really great. And Ling, thank you for putting this together and managing it. Hopefully, looking forward to seeing everyone in person next year.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's hope.
Let us hope too.
Yes.
Congratulations on the award, Chris.
Yes. Yeah.
Congratulations, Chris.
So richly deserved.
Thank you,
Absolutely.
Gene. That's very kind of you. And thank you, everyone. I think we should probably call it a day now. And thank you all for attendance and for your good wishes. Much appreciated.